Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for attending Partners of Scott County Watersheds October virtual forum. And before we get started, I would like to give you a little bit of information about the forum as well as Partners of Scott County Watersheds. So first of all, please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. You will see the ability to ask questions to our presenter through either the chat box or through the Q&A box in the Zoom app. And I will be reading those questions to Ken at the end of the presentation. So throughout the presentation, feel free to ask questions and then we will answer those at the end. So Partners of Scott County Watersheds is a nonprofit organization located in Scott County. And our mission is to improve the stewardship of Scott County watersheds through education, technical guidance, and volunteer opportunities. One of the ways we do that is through these monthly educational forums. They run from February through November, and they're always on the third Tuesday of the month from noon to 1. We had them at the libraries up until the pandemic, and so they're virtual for now. Stay tuned to hear more about the 2021 forums. We also have our Snapshot volunteer water quality monitoring events 3 times a year in May, July, and October. So stay tuned for those as well. We do have a membership and funding partnership program in order to keep our forums and our snapshots and our special workshops going. So those are the levels that we offer. And if you're interested in learning more about the benefits associated with those and what Partners uses our donations for, you can visit our website at www.partnersofscottcountywatersheds.org. Also, save the dates for our future programs. On Thursday, November 5th from 8 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., we have our free grant programs webinar. And this is an opportunity for you to learn about the different local, federal, and state cost share programs for those of you who are interested in doing water quality improvement projects on your property. Once again, it's a free program. If you go to our website, you can register for that, and you can attend all of the forums or all of the presentations, or you can tune in for individual presentations based on who you'd like to hear from. Also, our next forum will be Tuesday, November 17th from noon to 1 via Zoom. It will be a wrap up of all the Partners of Scott County Watersheds activities in 2020. And then stay tuned in 2021 to hear more about the snapshots. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will let Ken begin his presentation.
Am I unmuted now? Cassie, can you hear me? Brian, can you hear me?
Yes, you're unmuted and your screen is sharing.
Super. Well, thank you very much, Cassie, for the intro, and thanks for inviting me to give this presentation today. I will say that the last time that and I say we gave this presentation was back in February before the pandemic hit. And it's kind of a microcosm of the program in Iowa. is a collaboration between the Fisheries Bureau, the Water Quality Bureau, and the Department of Public Health. Unfortunately, the state toxicologist, my friend and colleague Stu Schmitz, passed away in May, and so I'll be presenting a portion of his talk. And then the fisheries biologist that's in charge of our Mercury project was busy today, I guess, tagging walleye somewhere. So it sounds a lot of fun. So he'll be unavailable. So bear with me as I get through this. And I'm gonna essentially provide kind of look in the past of our fish tissue monitoring in Iowa, what we're doing presently, and then what we hope to accomplish in the future. Okay, so if we look at historically, from about 1977, at least that's the results I have in my database, until 2012, we were part of US EPA's Region 7 Ambient Fish Tissue Monitoring Program, or called Raft. You have to bear with me, I use a lot of acronyms, and I'm not very original in the ones I come up with. And then from 2002 to 2006, we conducted a statewide random monitoring program, looking at the fish and the benthic macroinvertebrates and habitat, but we also included some whole fish tissue analysis. The Army Corps of Engineers does fish sampling on the flood control reservoirs in the state, and there's been some special studies and other monitoring done throughout history. So we'll take a look first at the Raft program. Again, it was Region 7 states, Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and Iowa. The Region 7 laboratory and facility down in Kansas City provided analytical and field support to the states. I believe this was the only region that of the EPA regions that offered this type of support. There were very few changes from 1997 to 2012, except in 1994. At the sites, both a predatory and a bottom feeding fish were collected. And in 2012, the analysis of the predatory fish switched, from fillet samples to tissue plug samples, which is essentially a 5mm biopsy tool. Like I said, it ended in 2012. What happened was EPA no longer would do other metals and different analyses, and they would only perform mercury analyses for the states. We left that program in 2013, but began sending mercury samples back to the EPA lab in 2019. We have continued the statewide monitoring program, and it's now known as IFTEMP. Again, not very original, the Iowa Fish Tissue Monitoring Program. Like I mentioned, the remap, from 2002 to 2006, we collected 207 different whole fish samples randomly from across the state. Unfortunately, most of those samples, because of where we sampled, headwater streams, smaller size streams, consisted of short-lived species or young fish, and therefore the contaminant levels, because those fish were young and not higher up the food chain, were low or not detected. The Army Corps collects fish tissue samples from Red Rock, Saylorville, and Coral reservoirs, and I'm not sure about Rathbun. That's in a different, and I see Leo's on the list. That's in a different region. I don't know if that's the correct name for that. But they follow our protocol essentially. They collect composite samples of whole fish, common carp, and predator species, fillets, or fish tissue plugs from about 5 to 6 total sites. We use those Army Corps data for integrated report assessments and for, if they're ever high enough, to issue consumption advisories. So we're getting kind of into the current here. Oh, here's some, I'm having trouble with my screen, so bear with me. So some of the other sampling that gets done in the state, our field offices and Land Quality Bureau have historically collected some project-specific samples. There has been some interest from municipalities and some private industries to collect fish tissue samples. And also universities and colleges across Iowa have been known to collect a few fish tissue samples. And last year, we started a project working with Simpson College on looking at some fish tissue and some different things, viruses and parasites type of thing. So our current statewide monitoring program, IFTEMP, like I said, it's a continuation of Raft. It's the only statewide program, and it's a partnership between the Water Quality and Fishery Bureaus and Department of Public Health. So I've been speaking a lot about all of these samples, and we'll get to numbers and results here soon, but why do we collect the fish tissue to analyze for toxic substances? Well, it's because fish can and usually do accumulate toxic substances of some level. Fish can also be used to identify changes in water quality. Some of the toxic parameters are so low in the water column they can't be measured, but they will accumulate or magnify in the tissue. And saying that, they can also accumulate enough or sufficient toxic substances to be a threat to human health. And lastly, and this has come up, and this will kind of be a theme throughout my talk, is that to Iowans, fish and fish consumption safety are very important. That shows up in the Fisheries Bureau's surveys that they do of anglers in Iowa. So we collect a lot of data. My section sometimes, I think deservedly so, in some cases gets knocked about. You collect a lot of data, don't synthesize it, report on it enough. But how do we use this IFTEMP, the fish tissue data? States and tribes are required every other year, even numbered years, to report on the state of their waters. As you can see, it's sections 303D and 305B of the Clean Water Act, and it's also known as the Integrated Report. Some of you may be aware of the Impaired Waters List. Well, the Impaired Waters List is actually section 303D. We use those data for those assessments. We also use the data for issuing and rescinding consumption advisories. Those are specific to water bodies. We use the data to design consumption advisory protocols. We use them to determine contaminant trend levels. And all of the annual reports that I put together can be found on our website. They are housed at the state library, and there's links on our website that you'll be able to go and look at all the data from every year of sampling. One thing we do not do, and I'm not sure if other states do, and take a little research, is we do not use the data to address potential impacts to fish consuming wildlife, whether it be mink, otter, eagles, etc. Broken down the type of sites that we go to and kind of assigned my own little hierarchy to them. Status sites, for example, if we wanted to go out to a lake or a river, that's kind of a primary type. Trend sites, we have now 15 sites that we've sampled over time, and we sampled whole fish, common carp, and do composite samples. Follow-up sites, that's where we go back if we have an elevated level of any toxic parameter. And because this was historically part of our EPA program, they've had their own direction they wanted to go. So we have sampled some random sites, some Class B lake sites. That's their terminology. That would include your small county park ponds and lakes, maybe some city ponds and lakes. And then we have collected some turtle samples, both soft shell and snapping turtle. So when we go to a status site, here's what we collect. We collect tissue plug samples from a predator species, 3 to 5 fish, and they're analyzed. Those individual samples are analyzed separately for mercury. Most of you probably know, but in our lakes in Iowa, we generally sample largemouth bass, sometimes walleye, sometimes northern pike. In our river samples, a lot of walleyes and a lot of smallmouth bass in northeast Iowa and some northern pike up in northwest Iowa. We also collect bottom feeding fish. Generally in our lakes, it's channel catfish. In our rivers, it's common carp. and we composite skin off fillet samples from 3 to 5 fish. And those are analyzed for mercury, chlordane, PCBs, and dieldrin. Historically, we've tried to sample these sites, lake sites every 10 years and river sites every 5 years, but with the funding and the staffing, it's unrealistic. And we try to sample as much and as often and as widespread as we can. I mentioned the trend sampling sites. It started out as 10 sites sampled every other year. We've increased that to 15 sites. We collect 3 to 5 whole common carp. And they're analyzed for mercury, chlordane, dieldrin, and PCBs. Next year will be a trend site year. And this is one of those things where we don't use them for consumption advisories because they are whole fish. However, we're able to look at the levels of contaminants through time and as a secure surrogate for some of those water quality samples that aren't able to detect things that show up in fish tissue. So where have we sampled? Here's a list of all the sites. Dark blue are the lakes, light blue are the rivers, and I believe we've collected a lake or a river sample in every county. And as you can see, we've done a considerable amount of Mississippi River sampling in Scott and Clinton counties. What have we found? So I put together a little synopsis of VivTemp results from 1977 to 2019. So north of 2,000 fish tissue samples have been collected from over 300 sites. During that time, the contaminant list has shrunk from approximately 30 parameters to 4, mainly because everything was showing up as non-detected. And so we didn't feel the need to keep analyzing for those. And then when we're in the Raft program, EPA shrunk the list also. Like I said, mercury is analyzed in the predator fish samples. Methylmercury is the part that's toxic, and that accumulates in the flesh, the tissue of the predators. Mercury, PCBs, dieldrin, chlordane are analyzed in the bottom feeder fish samples. And outside of the mercury, the PCBs, dieldrin, and chlordane, they're more of a fat loving and accumulate more in the fatty tissue of the bottom feeding fish. We sampled 130 lakes approximately and approximately 175 river sites. This doesn't include those 200 remap sites that we sampled randomly across the state. It's updated a little bit since I put this talk together. So first, let's take a look at chlordane. Chlordane is an organochlorine insecticide used for termite treatment that was banned in 1988. And there's a lot of different ways that you can analyze and show data. These are annual averages found in Iowa fish tissue samples. And it's a decent ski slope, we like to call it, down 0.6 milligrams per kilogram. That's also parts per million. That's the 1 mil per week advisory level in Iowa that Stu put together that I'll touch on a little later in my talk. This little blip here was actually, we switched labs and those were all non-detected, but they couldn't see down very far as our previous lab, but those were all non-detects. So if you put it down here, and as you can see, we've been well below the 0.6 for chlordane for a long time. PCBs get a lot of buzz. Chlorofluoride, I don't know, it's polychlorinated biphenyls. Our samples include the sum of 3 aerochlors, 3 of the aerochlors, and it's also another organochlorine. I'm on total PCB, sorry. PCBs. So the aerochlors are the PCBs. PCBs were used in capacitors and transformers. They're very stable, don't react to heat and cold, and that's why they were used. They were banned in 1977. Again, you can see coming down 0.2 ppm or milligram per kilogram is a 1 meal per week advisory in Iowa. We do have 2 PCB advisories in Iowa, including Pool 15 in Scott County. Again, this was a laboratory issue. These were all non-detects, and that's generally probably going to be down here as well. Go to Dieldrin. Stu was working on putting together advisory limits for Dieldrin before his passing. Another organochlorine insecticide banned in 1974 for most uses and banned in 1987 for termite control. This little bit, again, lab issue, but as you can see, the levels have been coming down. I would guess a consumption advisory range would probably be in the 0.2 to 0.3 range. Here's our mercury results through time. Stu came up with a 0.3 ppm at about 1 meal per week advisory level for the sensitive population. And it's hard to tell if it's, which way is it going? If you put a trend line on this, I will say that it's a little misleading in this area. From 2005 to 2014, we did a lot of follow-up sampling at sites that tested high, and that will always skew the data or bias the data high. Generally, we have low levels, but when I show you a map coming up, we have higher levels in our Northeast Iowa rivers and our Southern Iowa lakes. And whether that's a water quality issue, the water quality or the water chemistry, the bedrock up in the Northeast Iowa, I'm not sure. It would be a great research project for a graduate student or PhD student, I think. So when we develop advisory levels, what have we done historically? Well, from 77 to 05, we used the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration action levels for our advisories and assessments. Some states still use the action levels. Those are the same levels that restaurants and grocery stores would be held to. However, in 2006, DPH and Stu specifically developed risk-based advisory levels for 3 contaminants. And this was on with assistance from the EPA and looking around, but he came up with advisory levels for mercury, chlordane, and PCBs. So how do we issue currently an advisory on a water body? Well, it requires 2 samples above advisory levels to issue a consumption advisory, and 2 also to remove said consumption advisory. Those advisories are water body specific. When we do have levels above the advisory level, we conduct additional sampling on rivers to delineate the advisory length. And we publish those advisories on the DNR website in 2 locations, and also it's included in each of the annual fishing regulation booklets. Here's a text version of our current lake consumption advisories. All of them are for mercury, except for McKinley Lake in Union County. And I'm not sure, again, what's going on there. We need to get back there and sample. I don't know if there's a hot spot for PCBs just in that lake itself, but generally these are south of Interstate 80 and all, again, for largemouth bass. And then we did in Pole Miller Park Lake down in southeast Iowa for snapping turtle. Our river advisories: Cedar, Iowa, Mississippi Pool 15, and its PCBs, and its common carp greater than 20 inches in length. We're seeing some elevated levels of PCBs in the large carp in that pool. Everything else is mercury, all in northeast Iowa for the most part, outside of the West Fork Des Moines River. And we just go ahead and issue them to any and all predator fish, except for Volga, and I think it only has smallmouth bass as a predator fish. This may help you out a little more to look at a little better. The blue are all of the lakes that have current 1 meal per week consumption advisories. And then here's the river reaches that have current consumption advisories. Now, I think it's important to note, if I haven't said this already, that mercury, the consumption advisories are for the sensitive population only. And the sensitive population is defined as pregnant women, women who are planning to become pregnant, nursing mothers, and children 12 years of age or younger. Mercury is a little different than other things. It causes developmental issues in growing babies, infants, and children. We don't really see levels in Iowa that would affect the general population of mercury. PCBs, however, the two that we have, the one lake and one river, would apply to the general population. And I'd like to take a little time right now to talk in the broader context of the integrated report of the impaired waters list. You know, and it is important, and I work on that list. I co-lead that program also. However, when you look at that list, it's because a water failed either a criteria or a threshold for one of its designated uses. As you can see, I don't know how many of you have canoed or fished or waded our Iowa River. That's a pretty nice river. And it's impaired because of this consumption advisory. However, it doesn't mean that it's filthy, nasty, you know, unusable. It just means that it failed, or it failed to meet a water quality criteria on one or more of its designated uses. In this case, the class HH, or human health fish consumption designated use. So this is all fine and dandy, but we're not on an island, right? So what about the other states? What about our neighboring states? How's it looking for them? Well, just have to remember that you have to make apples to apples comparison, and I'll break that down in the next slide, but I'll just show you some of this. So, and I'm going to try to steal some of their mapping technology. I like the way Nebraska and South Dakota have put this together. Green fish, which means they're fine for consumption. Red exclamation point triangles, which means there's an advisory on those water bodies. Same kind of deal down here for Nebraska. Green is good, red is advisories. Missouri does it a little different. They have a statewide sensitive population mercury consumption advisory, which isn't shown. And then they have the full length of the Mississippi and Missouri River general population consumption advisories for PCBs. But remember, everything in context. So let's break it down a little further. Remember, Iowa is 0.3, ppm. Nebraska uses 0.215. They used an 8-ounce portion. Stu used a 6 or 7 ounce portion. South Dakota is still using the action level of 1 part per million. Missouri uses our same 0.3. However, they went ahead and issued a statewide advisory for sensitive population, which Iowa really has done, but it's not. We haven't done a good job of broadcasting that. And like I mentioned, the two major rivers have a statewide PCB advisory for all populations. Illinois issued a statewide mercury advisory, and all of their water body specific advisories are online in a search by county format. Minnesota, their threshold starts at 0.11 and includes 1 meal per week, 2 meals per week, 1 meal per month, and do not eat also. There's no statewide map, but their advisories are included in their lake database. So what about the future? So next couple of years, we're going to continue collecting and analyzing mercury data, which I'll speak on next. 2020, which I'm doing right now, is trying to research some of the emerging contaminants or things out there right now that we should be including in our analyses that we aren't, that could cause a threat to human health. PFAS comes to mind, right off the top of my head. Next year, we'll try to conduct the next round of trend sampling. And then in 2021 and 2022, we're going to finalize our length-based statewide mercury advisory levels. So that's kind of the history of the IFTEMP program, some data, some where we're going, where we've been type of thing. Next, I'm going to talk about a project that we've been working on for a long time and hope to wrap up in the next couple of years. That's developing statewide consumption guidelines in Iowa for predatory, for all fish that we've sampled. So we partnered with Iowa State in 2012 to try to develop statewide advisory levels for all of our fish. It ended in 2017, but after looking at the study and the data, we decided we needed to do a follow-up study. Our goal is to provide people in Iowa guidelines that will cover the entire state, broken down by lake and river, so they can make their own choices. Knowing if fish are safe to eat is one of the top 3 motivations, like I mentioned, for people to go fishing. So we're hoping to have this wrapped up and done by 2022, 2023. So where does mercury come from? Lewis put this slide in here, kind of like this life jacket that's at the top of this tree. You kind of wonder, how did it get there? Did it come on the flood? Did somebody play ring toss? I'm not sure. When you think about mercury, it comes from natural man-made sources: coal, fossil fuels, mining, volcanoes, volatilization from the ocean. And some of the studies I've read, most of it doesn't even originate in our country. Starts at the lower end of the food chain, goes up, smaller fish, bigger fish, and then whatever consumes those fish, bioaccumulation or biomagnification is how it works. So what are the effects of eating fish with methylmercury? Again, it affects primarily the at-risk population or the sensitive population. Pregnant women, nursing, planning to become pregnant, children under 12, and then our advisory levels at 0.3, 1 meal per week, and 1.0, no consumption. So the original study sites, these were all the lake sites, and these are all of our river sites. 37 lakes, 12 rivers. Here's the species that we collected. 18 species, length, weight, sex were documented, analyzed for fish tissue, and that included about 2,700 tissue samples from all length categories in all of these species. So what did we find out? Well, here are the species that didn't exceed the 0.3 ppm, 1 mil per week advisory level: bluegill, brown trout, rainbow trout, crappie, yellow bass, yellow purse, hybrid striped bass up to 26, sauger up to 21, white bass less than 17 inches were always below. We're safe to say that eating these fish, even for the sensitive population, will be safe. It gets a little messier, and I apologize for this plot, when we look at the largemouth bass results. We have mercury concentration on the left. Up here, red line denotes 0.3, length in bass in inches. One of the issues in the original study, if you'll see down here, I'm not sure if you can see my pointer or not, but we had a lot of unexplained non-detected. Even on here, it's well established that there's the length to concentration ratio in fish, or relationship at least. But when you have this, it really messes up the models. So where, there's the first departure above 0.3. but where is the real one? And it, as you can see, it does get a little messy. It's not easy to work with sometimes. So we're going to try to look, when we did our follow-up the last few years, next year, we're trying to look in this area. We're going to sample between 11 inches and 15 inches to try to fill in this gap. Okay, our follow-up study included some new lakes, focused on those little areas, try to find the break point in those levels where it exceeds our advisory level. We added some few fish species, sturgeon, drum, suckers, paddlefish. We selected lakes and rivers, locations based on ecological factors, and we'll be collecting another 2,400 samples between 2019 and 2021. Look at the walleye results. There's 0.3 at the top. Here's 20 inches. No departures above 0.3 until you get out to 20 inches. So this is a draft. It's not for publish or production yet, but this is the kind of thing we're going to try to come up with to make it easier to understand. Again, the sensitive or at-risk population. And I stress this is just our initial prototype before we started on our follow-up study to try to nail down these links. So this just models, and I'll show later in my presentation what the FDA and EPA came up with. So your best choices, even for the sensitive population, you know, all these fish, and then linked based on these fish. Good choices. These are fish that will exceed the 0.3, but still safe to consume on 1 meal per week. And then what we found was muskies were only fish species that were above the 1 part per million mercury level. So in summary, from the Mercury project, you know, we believe that Iowa caught fish are safe to eat with a very few consumption-related advisories for the average angler. Muskies were the only one in the do not eat. Some areas had higher mercury levels based on ecological features. River walleyes seem to have a higher levels of mercury at a shorter length than lake walleye. Could be something to do with growth rates. And advisories will be posted after the study is finished, and they're going to make sure that they're easy to read and to understand. Let's take a look now at Stu's portion of the talk and how the Department of Health fits into all this. So the toxicology is located with the Environmental Health Services Bureau. They provide toxicological principles to assessing risk to human health. They provide health assessments of substances found essentially everywhere, air, land, and water. And they've been involved with us since 2004, assessing health risks from contaminants in fish tissue. So how did Stu put this together, and what was his thinking behind how he came up with our current advisory levels? Well, first he wanted to encourage the consumption of fish, since eating fish is a part of a healthy diet. But, and it's a big but, we need to protect individuals that may eat large quantities of fish that can also contain toxic substances. So he conducted a review of studies on methylmercury, PCBs, and Chlordane, because these substances were the ones known to bioaccumulate in fish tissue. Here, a couple of his assumptions were made: 6 to 7 ounce meal size. And that meal size then was used to determine the potential dose of methylmercury, PCBs, or Chlordane. The advisory levels and meal restrictions were developed using 2 different things. One is called the lowest levels of known health impact, or low L, and known health impact levels, no L. I will say that the the advisory levels are not overly protective. However, they are below levels of any perceived health impacts for people eating fish. And then when he ran through this, he was able to give some recognition to the health benefits from eating fish. So here's our advisory levels currently in Iowa and have been since 2006. I've touched on this all the way through this talk, but here's where it's all put together. Here's the FDA action level, 0.3, advisory level, Iowa, unrestricted, 1 meal per week, do not eat, 0.6, 5 and over. Here's Mercury. Again, that action level of 1.0, 0.3, 0.3 to less than 1 meal per week, over 1, do not eat. Here's the 3 aerochlors that make up the sum PCBs, aerochlor 1248, 1254, 1260. The action level is very high. The FDA 2.0, that equals our do not eat. 0.2, unrestricted, 0.2 to 2, 1 meal per week. Let's do through this in here, the health benefits of eating fish. Fish are low in saturated fats and contain high quality protein and omega-3s, vitamins and minerals. Eating fish can contribute to a healthy heart, and eating fish can contribute to a child's growth and brain development. And pregnant women and nursing mothers urged to include fish, but with the caveat, eat more fish that contain lower levels of contaminants, especially mercury. They're listed here, and they'll be on the next slide. And eat less fish of known species that accumulate higher levels of mercury. A few years ago, and I didn't think I'd ever see this happen, the EPA and FDA worked together, and this is their current mercury consumption advisory literature. And again, it's what we're going to model ours after. It's switching from a do not over to a do, essentially, and I like it a little bit better. So here's the best choices. This is your store-bought restaurant type fish, as you can see, fish and shellfish. Eat 2 to 3 servings a week. Here's your good choices. Those are the best. Here's your good. They have a little more mercury in them, so just 1 meal per week. And then avoid your swordfish, your king mackerel, and your marlin, and your shark, because they have a lot of mercury in them. But they do include down here, I don't know if you can see it, if you catch your own fish, make sure you check state consumption advisories to tell you how and how many and how much of that fish you can safely eat. So I'll end it with this and take any questions. Question is, are Iowa fish safe to eat? And I would say yes, Iowa fish are safe to eat with a few precautions for the sensitive population regarding mercury and the general population due to the 2 PCB advisory water bodies that we currently have.
All right, thanks, Ken. We do have a couple of questions. Dave was asking why just mercury. He goes, other heavy metals are toxic and exposures to those have health risks too to fish and human. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, we have historically sampled for lead. We don't really see it show up in the fish tissue. I guess I don't have a complete answer, or maybe the answer you're looking for. I'll have to do a little research on why historically we haven't included any more heavy metals. I will include that in my research going forward on things to include as we try to revamp our fish tissue program. As we switch over to the statewide consumption advisories, we'll be spending less monies on sampling mercury across the state and be able to shift those monies over to, again, to maybe, like you mentioned, more different heavy metals, and then also some of the emerging contaminants that I spoke to.
Okay, and then Dave also asked, why did Iowa develop the 3 advisories versus the FDA levels?
That was just based on the EPA risk-based assessment approach. If you look across the country, a lot of states use the risk-based versus just the action levels of the FDA. So that it does include your tiered approach where, you know, from this level to from 0 to X level, it's safe to consume unlimited essentially. And then at this level, limit your consumption simply because the levels are present, but they're not too high yet. And then over a certain level is do not eat, no consumption, both for the sensitive population in regard to mercury and the general population in regard to everything else.
Okay, thank you. I will wait a few seconds to see if there's any other questions appearing in the chat. Once again, you can type your questions in the chat or the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And while we're waiting to see if there's other questions, I will let everyone know that Partners of Scott County Watersheds did record this forum, and we're going to put it on our new YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again, or if you know anyone that wasn't able to view it today, it should be up in the next week or so. Dave asked, any advisories on turtles right now?
Yeah, we have one consumption advisory for mercury on snapping turtles. I believe it's Paul Miller Park Lake. I can go back through and look, but I think it's Paul Miller Park Lake in Lee County. Our other sampling hasn't shown. I actually didn't know that there would the mercury would magnify in the turtles. I thought it'd be more of PCB exposure simply because of their interaction with the bottom sediments, but that didn't bear true. So, and just everybody, if you have other questions, you know, it's ken.krier@dnr.iowa.gov. You can always shoot me an email. You can go to our website. I did mention it, and I believe it to be true now that I've taken over a few of these programs, that we're going to make data more readily available, more user-friendly, so everybody can research this. We do have a lot of databases that are interconnected now, and we're going to that, where you can, you know, go to see how this water body is assessed, and then you'll automatically be linked to all the data that have been collected in that segment, including the fish tissue data. So I think it's a step in the right direction, and it's going to be way more user-friendly for the people of Iowa going forward.
All right, well, I don't see any additional questions, so we'll go ahead and end it. Thank you so much, Ken, for taking the time to give us your presentation, and thank you to the participants who attended today, and hopefully we'll see you for next month's forum. Have a good day.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Cassie.